I had sailed south in the bark Aurora in the winter of 1847, bound for the whaling grounds around South Georgia, and we had come to expect cold, isolation, and the particular superstitions of men who chased leviathans. What none of us expected was to watch. From the lee of an ice floe, a pale figure stand where no man should have been. An encounter that unmoored more than our navigation for the remainder of that voyage. We had made our leaving from Nantucket in late 1846. A brisk dawn piled with snow and the sound of boots on plank. 28 souls signed away the comforts of home. The captain, 2 mates, a purser, 6 harpooners, 3 boat steerers, and the rest hands to tend sails and fires. The Aurora rode low in the water with casks for oil stowed below and chests lashed to the spar deck. Among them, the small brass chest containing our sextant, and the chronometer was kept under the mate's bunk. Those instruments were religion to us, as necessary as the cook's single iron pot and the try-works whose flame would, in time, warm the ship with the reek of rendered blubber. Provisions were simple and plain. Salted beef, biscuit, and the occasional barrel of molasses, each ration measured by the purser and passed hand to hand beneath a sky that knew neither mercy nor apology. The try-works burned through our first weeks, the smoke smeared the horizon, and the air about the quarterdeck smelled of coal, hot iron, and oil. We lashed the longboats amidships, secured with extra tackles so they would not part company in a sudden sea. Those boats would be our instruments of pursuit, the little open wood that would carry a harpooner and 2 hands to where the whale rolled like a dusk-swept hill. Navigation was a daily, stubborn discipline. Each noon the sextant came from its chest, and I climbed the small companionway to take a sun sight while the chronometer sat ticking in the mate's care, its steady heart measuring our longitude against the heavens. We kept a running log, soundings, compass bearings, the drift of ice, since the Southern Ocean would not suffer a man's vagueness. The compass would flutter and sometimes rebel beneath the masts, and we noted deviation when the copper sheathing began to chatter from cold. At night, the watch would call the bearings, and the chronometer's steady beat became the metronome to our progress. Sea and weather took their toll. Gales came with the abruptness of a closed fist spray, froze upon the shrouds into glassy beards that the men chipped with knives. Frost creaked underfoot. Hands, raw from rope, moved with the muscle memory of habit, reefing, furling, tending the try-works iron cauldrons, while the ship rolled like a beast asleep and dreaming of storm. The cook laboured beneath a thin roof of smoke, ladling out the softened biscuit, each portion a small thing of comfort. In the evenings, the men clustered near the binnacle, sharing tobacco and superstition tales of phantom ships, and sea sprites were told in low voices meant for windless nights. Captain Ellery, stern as an old chart, listened with a grave face, his hand often on the chronometer's wooden case, as if time itself were a rope he might hold fast. As we drove southward, our charts narrowed into lines, latitude and longitude drawn with ink and confidence, and the sealing grounds near South Georgia loomed like a flat, phantom coast in the mind before they were ever sighted. Ice began to punctuate the sea, small bergy bits at first, then ridged floes that drifted and scraped the hull with a dry, grinding note. We kept a wary distance, for a floe could catch the ship and hold us like a rat in a trap. Yet we drew close enough to note the grey sheen of its face and the peculiar flowers of blue that lay beneath the surface. On the morning when the sea turned from black to a nearer slate, the men were unusually silent. We trimmed sails and took quick sun sights. The log shows our course, our reckoning, a line of measures that should have assured us of our place in that vast, indifferent sea. The longboats were lashed still, but I could see the harpooners' hands on the ropes, the boat steerers' eyes fixed along the bowsprit, as if expecting a thing to split the horizon. A thin wind bit the cheeks, and the taste of iron hung again in the mouth. The Aurora rode close to an ice floe to leeward, the floe giving us a momentary haven from the swell. We lay there, engines of routine and habit, not yet knowing that the sight we were about to exchange for chart and compass would make men whisper of the world's margins for years to come. As we neared South Georgia, the sky grew low and the barometer fell. Katabatic gusts scoured the decks, and fog would roll in from the packis, swallowing sound with it. The almanac on my chest, the sextant stowed wet with spray, recorded latitude and a longitude that altered more by dead reckoning than by trust in our chronometer. Hargreaves had cursed the instrument twice that morning for gaining minutes in the cold. Canvas flapped and the binnacle glass steamed. The try-works had long since been banked for the season, and the smell of rendered blubber gave way to a raw scent of sea and ice. Birds that should have followed us, albatross and prions, kept their distance. At the ice edge, the seals hauled out in numbers that made old Jensen frown, so that even our oldest hands muttered about the seas growing quiet. We wore thick coats of oiled wool and stockings bound with tarred rope. The boats were made ready as though for a whale, with oars blackened by use and harpoons lashed to thwarts. Hargreaves ordered the whaleboats lowered at daybreak, not for the chase of a leviathan, but for the safer pick of seals and birds to supplement our provisions. We had provisions enough: salt beef, ship's biscuit, a cask of molasses. But a long voyage breeds habits of preparation, and every man knew to be ready where the ice could close and the surf could swallow a boat in a minute. The first sign came as a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but an active thing. The creak of the mast, the slapping of halyards, even the cry of a gull were blunted as though the fog itself absorbed noise. I leaned upon the rail and felt the cold press through the leather of my gloves. The lookouts reported a pale smudge upon a floe some 3 cables off, hard to make by eye at first, for the sea there held the wit of old frieze and the foaming rims of pressure ridges. I fetched a glass and found a figure standing upright upon the ice, like a statue too alive for comfort. It was not a seal, nor one of the stranded penguins. Its outline was humanoid. Pale as the underside of a floe, it stood with an elongation of limb that set it apart from any man I had seen. It wore no clothing as we understand it. Where there ought to be garments, there was skin, and what might have been hair plastered like kelp to its shoulders. Its head turned slowly toward us with a motion that caught the light, if one can call that leaden day by any change of light, and for a moment its face resolved into something of a countenance. The eyes were deep and dark, and reflected the ship as if we were lights upon a sullen pool. Hargreaves ordered the cutter out. We were mad, some said later, fools who chased a shape into the teeth of a southern fog where the charts show little but danger. But the men obeyed, as if roused by the old, necessary instinct to look upon whatever the sea offered. We manned the oars. The whaleboat slid through scud, and the men pulled with the breath steaming from their mouths, the boat's keel grinding against broken ice, the lashing of the falls creaking back on the davits. When we were within 2 boat lengths, the figure moved. It did not run as a man runs, nor did it leap as a seal. Instead, it melted sideways between flows, an ease of motion without struggle. We struck with a harpoon only at the place where it had been. The iron met nothing but ice. There were no tracks upon the floe, save the impression of its feet, shallow and too small for a boot. Jensen, who had been a Greenlander, spat and said that the sea had tricks older than his tongue. A smell rose then, faint and not wholly like anything I had known, salt and something like the inside of a dead cucumber. We rowed to where the figure had vanished, the fog closing like a curtain. My hand trembled not for fear of death, but for the strain of the cold and the knowledge that we had crossed some invisible shore. The chronometer now read askew our latitude, as taken by sextant could not be squared with the depth soundings Hargreaves called for. The lead line brought up nothing but green water and a whisper of silt. We called to the ship, our voices sank. The cutter's thwarts dripped with a slurry of brine. When we looked back, the ship showed like a grey ghost, its sails hulking, men upon the lee rail like black knots. Hargreaves ordered retreat. Prudence, not superstition, drove his hand. Yet, even as we made for the davits, the party-sheet figure reappeared upon an adjacent floe and looked at us with that same steady gaze. It did not approach. It did not flee. It watched as a surveyor watches a chart. In the boat there was a hush beneath the oars, an attentive silence that was almost worship. We were hauled aboard, and the cutter was hoisted. The deck swarmed with questions, and the old men exchanged glances that had remembered other strange things of the polar seas. Stories of pale visitors borne upon ice, of white shapes at the waterline that come with a falling barometer. No man spoke of what the figure might be. We catalogued only what we had seen and what we could measure. The bearing, the time by ship's bell, the wind from the northeast at force 6, the falling mercury, and the lack of birdsong. As we slipped further into the fog, the pale shape stood at the edge of sight, and then was swallowed by it. We set a watch and doubled lines, for the sea had become a different thing, one that contained a presence we could not chart. I wrote these lines in the warmth of the cabin later that night, the lamp guttering as if the very light feared the memory on deck. The men kept to their tasks, but their hands moved with an edge, and Jensen hummed an old Greenland song under his breath. We pressed westward towards South Georgia because there was no other course that made sense. Yet nobody among us would deny that something unaccounted for had marked the voyage, and that the sea had shifted its face beneath our keel. We had made sail for the southern grounds by first light, the binnacle fitted with its oil, and the chronometer set against the ship's log for the noon sight. I remember the morning as if in a negative, each detail arrested by the cold. Tarred hemp creaked underfoot, the try-works smoked a thin, bitter scent aft, and the men moved with the slow, careful deliberation of those who had lived long among ice and rope. It was then the coxswain came running aboard, breathless, his cap in his hand, the longboat at his shoulder. He had been out in the cutter to sound near an outlying berg when he spoke of our harpoon line. Not broken clean by a whale, but torn, the iron head bent as though against a blunt and unyielding substance. He laid the coil upon the waist, and there upon the gunwale of his boat was a pale, chalky smear, as if some white substance had been dragged and left in haste. The smear powdered under our fingers like lime. We stood about it, and were all of us silent. Silence among whalers is not the absence of speech, but the weighing of facts. While I went forward to consult with the mate, a colleague had gone ashore to take bearings upon a hummock of ice, and returned with a face I shall not soon forget. He had found, in powdered snow, a series of elongated bipedal prints leading toward the berg and away from the soundings, and none returning. The prints were long and narrow, as though made by a foot with an extra length to the stride, and the toes left no separate impressions, such as those of a walrus or a seal. He traced them with the barrel of his hand, then looked up at us and said only that they were not of any creature he had seen in the South Seas. The mate set down a sober memoranda in the log. March 14th, longboat returned harpoon line found torn chalky smear upon gunnel prints, elongated and bipedal, found upon Leeberg cask of blubber punctured without teeth of seal or marks of driftwood. He wrote the last with the same steady hand he used when charting courses. We had found the cask in the lower storeroom that afternoon, a single hogshead of rendered blubber meant for the try works. The bung had been driven thin in a manner not consistent with the teeth of a seal, nor in the parallel gouges of driftwood. The mate tapped the puncture with his nail. There was no jaggedness, as would be left by an animal with fangs, nor any splintering wood. More curiously, the men who had handled the rope that morning swore of a sensation, as they took the coil upon the capstan. As their palms brushed the strands, they felt something slick and cold against their skin, like the touch of meltwater upon a corpse. They used the old seaman's words, slick, cold, as if something had passed from the line to the hand. I felt it myself when I hauled in a tail rope to examine the fibre. A thin film clung to the strands, and the smell was not of salt alone, but of something faintly sweet and stale, a remnant of flesh gone soft. We discussed options in the waist under the lee of the mizzen. Some urged we put off in the longboat and make search of the berg. Others counselled caution, that men might be sacrificed to curiosity, where ice could shift and close without warning. The captain, who had spent 3 decades in these waters and read the face of his men as well as any chart, ordered a party to go ashore at dusk. 2 hands, the coxswain, and myself. We took with us a coil of spare hemp, the mate's pistol more for signal than expectation, a brace of lances and a file to dress iron, and a lantern with smouldering pitch. As dusk fell, the southern grounds lay in a bleak, low light. The berg rose like a pale cathedral, its facets catching the last of the sun. The prince led up one rib of the berg and vanished once more at a ledge, as though their maker had stepped over some boundary invisible to us. We followed until our boots slipped upon a crust, until the lantern threw our shadows vast and slender upon ice. At the ledge, we halted the air. There had a distinct chill that tightened the lungs, and the chalky smear reappeared, smeared upon a sloping face, as if something had brushed past in passing. We left the berg then, and returned to the ship with the line of prints behind us, and a new, colder sense of being in view of something not yet named. The mate appended the day's entries with a hand that trembled slightly, and nailed the cork of the punctured cask back in place. At supper, the men sat nearer to the binnacle and spoke in low tones, and the rope that had been handled that afternoon still dried in the lee, bearing its faint film. We set watches, and the helmsman who relieved me at midnight kept his lantern near the rail for the whole of his watch. There remained no sound, save the hush of ice against hull, and the faint, impossibly distant crack that might have been the berg shifting. Yet in the morning, the prince continued, and toward the south we knew we must put off again, for the southern grounds were not to be abandoned when the chase drew near. We made ready the boats with a different gravity than before, the memory of the chalky smear and the cold film upon our hands weighing upon each movement, and I could not rid myself of the thought that we had been observed by a pale figure that kept its distance with an intelligence we had not yet earned the right to name. At dawn, we took 2 boats to investigate, and I saw it, standing on a narrow floe, a pale, near-luminous shape, about the height of a man but too attenuated, its skin white as candle grease in our oil lamplight. It did not call nor flee, only turned its head slowly toward us. The figure's motion was deliberate and unnatural. When one of our men called out, it lifted a whitish hand and stepped into the grey water as if it belonged there, then blinked into the fog, leaving the men aboard frozen with oars mid-stroke. For a long moment, nothing moved, but the lamp's weak flame and the thin hiss of melting ice. My fingers, numb despite gauntlets of oiled sheepskin, found the thole-pin by habit, and I felt the old reflex of seamanship. Count the crew, take stock of tools. There were 6 of us between the 2 boats. The coxswain, my mate Harker, Jonah with his hair stoved by salt, and 3 others whose faces had already grown to the cold. We had our harpoons, a pair of swivels carved from the ship's spare tackle, and a pocket sextant in a rubbed leather case. The chronometer on the ship had been set by noon the day prior. I had the time by heart, and could tell roughly where we lay by the swell and the drift ice. Yet those measures seemed suddenly superfluous in that hush. We rowed nearer, each pull of the oar making a small complaint in the glassy water. Sea breeze stung our lips. The lamp smoke smelled of whale oil and tar. The floe was no larger than a piano, and tilted with waves beneath, a brittle sheet of cease mottled with bloodless rime. The pale figure remained upright where it stood, as though the floe were firm ground. Its head turned once more to watch us, and I noted the shape of its face, too long, with hollows where a man's cheeks should be, and eyes that reflected the lamp as if they were glass. I could not say whether there was hair upon its brow, only that the skin had the sheen of something kept moist and cold. When Harker whispered the name of the captain, an attempt at levity to steady his hand, the figure lifted its hand and stepped off the floe. There was no splash in the sense we know the surface closed over it without ring or ripple, and then it was gone. For the length of a breath, the fog lay heavy and blank, and then there came from the direction of the floe a sound like cloth drawn over rock. Jonah shied and let his oar dip. The boat slowed. We made after it at once, but visibility fell to pistol shot, and the water swallowed our progress as if the world itself had been pinched. We beat back to the ship under a sky of hard, indifferent light, and the crew aboard her crowded the rail to listen to our tale. Captain Murdoch ordered the log to be struck. I set down the hour, June 12th, 1859, by the chronometer, and noted latitude and longitude as best the fog allowed. He sent 2 men in the longboat to the place again with a lantern and a sounding lead, for we would not leave an unknown hazard unmarked. They returned an hour later, sullen and speechless, with only a circular stain on their oars where the ice had brushed them, and a scrap of what looked like fine white membrane clinging to the boat's thwart. We laid the scrap upon the chart-room table, and I traced its edge with a trembling thumb. It was cool and slick and left a mark of salt. No man aboard afterwards would row a course through that stretch before noon. Jonah ceased to sleep for more than an hour at a time and kept his oilskin on in his berth. Harker would not answer if asked to go upon the ice. The captain wrote a short note to the agent at Port Jackson, and it was forwarded with an enclosure to a correspondent of the Royal Society. Whether it ever received serious notice there, I cannot say, for the ship's business did not abide by polite curiosity. We burned the scrap of membrane rather than keep it the smoke that Rose seemed to carry with it a small and insoluble sorrow. People asked in later months whether we had been frightened, and my true answer is in the blank places of that day. The hesitation at the oar, the lamplighting of a hand, the insubstantial way the figure returned to the water. We put 2 other grounds, and the southern grounds remained for that voyage a line of pale ice and unanswered questions. Years have passed since men have told the tale and altered its angles, but the log lies in my trunk, and the captain's note in an envelope still sealed. When I set my sextant by a bright window now, my hand still remembers the weight of the oar and the tilt of the flow, and I find no solace in measurement for what we saw. The question of what belonged to sea and what to shore kept its teeth, and we kept our distance. We beat back to the Aurora with one of our small boats mangled along the lee, and 3 mouths that would not stop trembling. It was the 14th of August, 1856, and the ice shelf lay to windward like a pale continent. In the dusk, the wind came hard off it, stinging with the smell of crushed brine and old snow. I remember the taste of salt on my tongue and the iron of fear in my hands as we drew near enough for Captain Hollis to order every spare hand to the halyards. We made full sail that night and stood off under the groan of spars. The binnacle lamp threw a weak orange against the binnacle glass, and the chronometer kept its slow, stubborn tick steady as a heart. In the log, he entered the affair under the single phrase, unaccountable circumstance, a curt admission that suited his reserve. The damage to the small boat was immediate and undeniable. Plank stove, a thwart splintered, the oarlocks broken. We had patched her with canvas and tar as sailors do, but she would not answer the sea as she had in the morning. One man, Jory by name, bore a bruise across his jaw and the look of a man who had seen a thing he could not name. Another, the cooper, kept rubbing his arms as if to warm them against a cold that did not come from the air. We took our bearings with the sextant at dawn, as prudence demanded latitude by noon cut 70 degrees south, longitude estimated from the chronometer. Our instruments told us where we were, but nothing of what had been upon the ice. We ate little that day. The galley stank of train oil and boiled salt pork. The kettle hanged cold while we listened to the rigging whispering and the sea striking the hull like a slow fist. Men checked their gear in small, habitual ways to still a larger unsettlement. A capstan line assessed, a harpoon examined for splinters, a lantern's oil measured. I found myself retelling the sequence to whoever would listen, each telling trimming the edges of uncertainty into shape so that it would fit into a story a man could live with. We had seen a pale figure stand where no man should stand, upright upon a floe that could not support a mass, or else erected by some manner that mocked our understanding of weight and balance. And when that figure turned, It was not in the ordinary fashion of a human neck, but with a slow, unnatural grace that left me without a word to name it. Captain Hollis kept his counsel. He ordered the course to the southern grounds and gave the men extra grog at dusk to steady hands that would soon be called. In the watch below, there was little sleep. The steward kept count of the plates and cups. The carpenter took a lantern into the darkness to inspect rigging, and I took to the quarterdeck to feel the dust of the sea under my boots and to scribble until the pen ran dry. We ran the log precisely, time of sighting, weather, names of those present, a notation of the damaged boat, and a list of stores consulted. The entry read exact, deliberate, facts set against an absence of explanation. When at last we made for port, the sighting found its way through the whaling taverns with the speed of rum and the slow certainty of gossip. Men who had never seen the ice shelf yet swore they had felt its breath. The ship's log, those dry, ruled pages, was copied and sent to a maritime collection, where learned men could appraise it by lamplight and the rules of navigation. Yet among all the sober hands that inspected the pages, the figure remained unnamed. In the tavern talk, it acquired adjectives, and in the scholars' reports, it acquired margins. In neither did it take a name that satisfied those whose eyes had beheld it. We left the southern grounds with less than we had brought, one boat broken, a shy tally of lost time, and in our hold a quiet that no lantern could chase away. Men stared as we stepped ashore in Hobart and spoke less of whales than of what they had not been able to explain. Years have passed since I set those entries by the kerosene light, and yet the thing we saw hangs like a smudge upon the charts in my mind, a mark without a heading. I keep the log's copied page among my papers by daylight. It is neat and undeniable. By night, it raises the hair upon my arms. We recorded what we could measure and, in the end, carried with us what we could not, an unresolved shape upon the map, and men who knew in the silence after the pipes had been stowed that some things in the Southern Ocean keep their secrets.